Hello everyone, welcome to Encryption, the tech tips and tutorial channel. In this video tutorial of IP addressing and subnetting, I will teach you the basic concepts of IPv4 addressing. So let's get started. IPv4 address is a 32-bit logical address used to uniquely identify a device on a network. Each IPv4 address has 4 numbers separated by a period called dotted decimal notation. Number range is between 0 to 255. This means an IPv4 address cannot be any range larger than 255. So it's between 0 to 255. The IPv4 address range 0 to 255 is divided into 5 different classes. An example of IPv4 address is 192.168.1.0/24. This is basically a network address. We will learn about host address and network address in the future slides. So here you can see that it has 4 blocks: block 1, block 2, block 3 and block 4. And each block is separated by a dotted decimal notation. The overall IPv4 range is divided into 5 classes as is given on the table. IPv4 address is divided into 5 classes. They are Class A, Class B, Class C, Class D and Class E. The Class A range is from number 1 to 126. The default subnet mask of Class A is 255.0.0.0 and the prefix value or the CIDR notation is /8. This means if you see any IP that starts from 1 and in between 126, that is Class A IP address. For example, 125.10.10.200. This is a Class A IP address. As you can see, this has 4 blocks. To identify the class of this IP address, we should always see the first block. If the first block is in the range of 1 to 126, then this is a Class A IP address. Here in our example, since 125 is in between 1 and 126, this is a Class A IP address. Similarly, Class B IP address has the range from 128 to 191. The default subnet mask is 255.255.0.0. The prefix value or the CIDR notation is /16. We will deep dive into prefix value and the CIDR notation and also about the subnet mask in the future slide and the future demonstration. For now, it's enough if you remember the range of Class A, B, C, D and E IP addresses. Next, if you see any IP address that starts from 192 and in between 223 in the first block, then that is the Class C IP address. Class C IP addresses always have the default subnet mask as 255.255.255.0. The default prefix value or the CIDR notation is /24. Likewise, the Class D IPv4 address starts with 224 or 224 and ends with 239. It is used for multicasting. So we do not assign a Class D address to any hosts. The last class of IP address, Class E range, starts from 240 to 255. This range is used for research and development purposes. So the addresses on this range is also not assignable to host. So we assign the IP addresses ranging from 1 to 223 or from Class A to Class C to the hosts in a network. Moving on to the next, you might wonder that any of the ranges does not include the address starting from the number 127. Does any IP address starts with 127? Yes, it does. But we did not see on the range. That's because any address that starts with 127 is not assigned to any host in the network. Instead, it is reserved for the local host. This means that this is my host. This laptop is my host. This is my local host. And the IP address of the local host is 127.0.0.1. So the range of 127 is reserved for local hosts and for loopback addresses to check the hardware. Moving on to the next topic of IPv4 concepts, we should also understand that IPv4 addresses are classified into two: the network address and the host addresses. A network address represents a block of host addresses. For example, I have an IP address or the network address 192.168.1.0/24. This is a network address of class C. It represents a block of host addresses. In networking, a host address indicates to an address that is assigned to a particular host. If we have 192.168.1.0/24 network, we will have the host addresses ranging from 192.168.1.1, likewise 1.2, and all the way to 1.254. The last address, 192.168.1.255, is the broadcast address. This means that there are 254 valid host addresses that can be assigned to a host or a computer or computing devices such as our laptop or mobile phone or server or any other in this network. About the host, node, peripheral and other node networking terms in detail, I have created another video that you can find in the description. The broadcast address, on the other hand, is an address that every device in the network uses to broadcast their message to every other host in the network when required. So every host gets a network address, host address, subnet mask, and the broadcast address when it participates in a network. Okay, up until now we have learned about network address, host address, and broadcast address in brief. We will have a separate video about them in detail, but for now I am just trying to make you understand about network address and host addresses. Again, network address represents a block of host addresses that can be assigned to a computer or host in the network. The addresses from 192.168.1.1 to 192.168.1.254 are in the same network, and this is represented by this address 192.168.1.0. This is a network address and it represents multiple host addresses, and host address is an address of a particular host. Out of overall range from 0 to 255, some IP ranges are separated or reserved for private IP range. Let's see about them as well. Let's see about them from the class A or from 1 to 126. The range from 10.0.0.0 to 10.255.255.255 is class A private IP address. The class B private IP address range is from 172.16.0.0 to 172.31.255.255. The default subnet mask is the same as the public IP address. The class B IP address range is from 128 to 191, out of which this range is reserved for private IP address, and the class C overall IP address range is from 192 to 223. From this range, from 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255 is reserved for private IP addresses. We will discuss about the difference of private IP addresses and public IP addresses later in the video. For now, just remember and know that these ranges are reserved for private purpose or for private IP addresses. Now, to check your understanding, let me ask you a question. The address 172.15.10.10 is private or public? This is my question to you. Please try to answer it. IP address 172.15.10.10 is private or public? Now check your answer with my own. This is class B public address, because to identify if a class B address is private or public, you need to see the first two blocks. Here 172.15. These two blocks should always match to the range of class B private IPv4 address to be the private IP address. Since the second block of the given IP address does not fall in the range from 172.16 and 172.31, this is not a class B private address. Rather, this is a class B public IP address. So if I have 192.167.x.x, then this is also a public address. because this is out of this range. So if any IP address you see that starts from 10, that is class A private IP. And if you see any IP address that starts from 172.16 and in the range between 172.31, then that is class B private IP address. And if you see any IP address with 192.168, then you should know that that is a class C private IP address. Now I hope you guys are clear about the IPv4 address and private IP ranges. This is very important to remember and know the range of overall range of class A, class B and class C IP addresses and the private IP ranges out of them which are reserved for assigning IP addresses in the local area network or the LAN, or they are called the private IP addresses. Now let's move on to the next slide and learn about the difference between private IP and public IP addresses. The first difference is that the public IP address is globally unique, whereas the private IP address is locally unique. That means the public IP is unique in the world. For example, if I am given 124.10.10.200, then this IP cannot be given to anyone else in the world. This falls in the public IP address range, and if this IP is given to me, that cannot be given to anyone else until I release this IP address. So public IPs are globally unique, whereas private IP is locally unique. This means that if I have a LAN, I have some PCs in the LAN. For example, I have 3 PCs. If I assign this PC with the IP address 192.168.1.10, then I cannot assign the same IP address to other hosts in the LAN. So this is why this is called locally unique. Now we know that the private IP addresses are unique in the local area network and public IP addresses are unique in the wide area network or in the internet. Let's move on to the another difference, that is public IPs are routable in the internet, whereas private IP is not routable in the internet. Let's assume that I have this LAN which is connected to an internet service provider. I have a router here, then I have a LAN here. This is a LAN and this is a WAN or the wide area network. Here if I send anything from this LAN to the WAN, I should send this with a public IP mapped because this private IP is not routable in the internet. So every LAN when it goes to the wide area network should have public IP address. That's because public IP only is routable in the internet. The mapping of private IP to the public IP is done by a protocol, that is NAT or the network address translation. If we are using private IP, then we must have a public IP to route the network packets to the internet, or if our destination host is on the internet or in the different network. The next difference is that public IP is assigned by an ISP or IANA. IANA stands for Internet Assigned Number Authority, and it is a global body to regulate IP addresses and other internet numbers. So the public IP address of my home or of my office is assigned by ISP. And ISP gets public IP addresses from IANA. In contrast, private IP is assigned by you or a network administrator. We can assign any IP range of private IP address in our local area network. We can either assign class C private IP address to our LAN, or we can assign any address from class B private IP range or any IP addresses from class A range. So it is our choice which private IP range we want to assign to our LAN. Another difference between the public and the private IP address is that the public IP needs to be purchased while the private IP is available for free. If you have the internet and if you are surfing the internet or working with the internet, there must be a public IP address in your network to route your packets to the internet. So we should understand that with our internet subscription, if it is our home plan, we have also paid for the public IP as well, along with the internet subscription. Last but not the least, public IP is mostly used in the wide area network or in the internet, and private IP is mostly used on the local area network or in the LAN. Okay guys, these are the key differences between public IP and private IP address. I hope you have understood the difference between a public IP and private IP, and you will use a public IP and private IP accordingly as per your need and as per their usability when you design, plan and implement a network. I hope now you are clear about the concept of IPv4 address. We will start subnetting IPv4 addresses in the next video lecture. Let me revise the lesson. IPv4 address is a 32-bit logical address used to uniquely identify a device on a network. An IP address has 4 blocks, each separated by a period called a dotted decimal notation. The IPv4 address number range can be between 0 to 255. The number range from 0 to 255 is divided into 5 different classes. The example of an IPv4 address is 192.168.1.0/24, and this /24 is the CIDR notation, or the classless interdomain routing notation, that we will deep dive into each in other video lecture. The overall IPv4 range is as shown. Class A range is from 1 to 126. The default subnet mask of the class A address is 255.0.0.0 and the prefix value is /8. The range of class B address is 128 to 191. The default subnet mask is 255.255.0.0. The prefix value is /16. Likewise, the class C range is from 192 to 223. The default subnet mask is 255.255.255.0. The prefix value is /24. The class D IP address range starts from 224 to 239. The class D address is used for multicasting. We have already discussed that the class D address is not assignable to hosts. The class E address range starts from 240 to 255. This is basically used for research and development. This is also not assignable to the hosts in a network. So only the IP addresses of class A, B and C are assignable to hosts. Any address that starts with 127 in the first block is reserved for localhost. Network address represents a block of host addresses, whereas host address represents an address of a particular host. The private IP address range of class A is 10.network, class B is 172.16 to 172.31, and the class C private address is 192.168.0.0 to 192.168.255.255. We also learned the differences of private IP and public IP addresses. Just to revise, a public IP address is globally unique, whereas private IP address is locally unique. Public IP is routable in the internet, whereas private IP is not routable in the internet but routable in the local area network. Public IP is provided by an ISP or IANA, whereas the private IP address is assigned by a network administrator. We need to purchase public IP, but the private IPs are available for free. Private IP is mostly used on the wide area network or the WAN, whereas the private IP is mostly used on the local area network or the LAN. Okay guys, that's all for this video. I hope the video tutorial was useful to you. If you have any query, any confusion, please write in the comment section or directly write a message to me. Please subscribe our YouTube channel and hit the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video. See you in the next. Until then, have a nice time. Goodbye.